האם זה באמת סגולה בדוקה? הסגולה ללמוד בזה?
Erev Tov, good evening, Dobra V'Yetcher. We are in the Zera Shimshon on Parshas Balak. We're going to do Os Vav, section number 6. Before we begin, we're going to take a look at a pasuk from the Parsha and also a couple of psukim from sefer Yehoshua. Let's start with Parshas Balak. This is Perek Chav Gimel pasuk Tes. Ki merosh tsurim erenu. This is Bilam talking, and he says, because from the top of rocks I have seen it. The it is referring to the nation of Israel. Umi givaos ashurenu. Excuse me. And from the hills I have gazed upon it, again meaning gazed upon the people of Israel. Hanam levadod yishkon, behold, it is a nation that dwells by itself. Uvagoyim lo yischashav, and among the nations it is not counted. That's from our pasuk, and that's Bilam talking about looking and gazing upon the Jewish people. Now let's take a look at Sefer Yehoshua. This is Parak Hey, Psukim Beis and Gimel. And it's talking about incident and a very important episode that took place right after the Jewish people crossed over the Yarden into Eretz Canaan. Ba'es hahi amar Hashem el Yehoshua. At that time, Hashem said to Yehoshua, Aseh lecha charvos tsurim, make for yourself sharp knives. Vayomal es bnei Yisrael. One second, I'm sorry. Vishuv mol es bnei Yisrael shenis, and go back and circumcise the Jewish people for a second time. Next pasuk. Vayas lo Yehoshua charvos tsurim, and Yoshua made for himself sharp knives. Vayomal es bnei Yisrael, and he circumcised the Jewish people, el givas ha'arolos, at a place called the hill of the foreskins. The psukim go on to explain what does it mean that Yehoshua circumcised the Jewish people a second time. So the psukim go on to explain that before the Am Yisrael left Mitzrayim, there was a mass circumcision. People were circumcised. All the men were circumcised before they left Mitzrayim. But then during their 40 years traveling through the wilderness, the babies that were born were not circumcised. It was considered dangerous to circumcise a baby during their travels in the midbar, in the wilderness, so they were not circumcised. And when they came into Eretz Yisrael, or Eretz Canaan, as it was at that time, Hashem commanded Yehoshua to have a mass circumcision of all of the people who they were originally babies that were born, but now they could be up to 40 years old. All of the children and adults, the male children and adults that hadn't been circumcised during the years in the wilderness, were circumcised at this place, and that's what's being described. That is how the psukim read in Sefer Yehoshua. We're going to see in this piece a different explanation as to exactly what was being referred to. So let's get into the Zera Shimshon. Parshas Balak, section Vav, section 6. Ki merosh tsurim erenu, because from the top of rocks I have seen it, v'chulei, etc. Uvagoyim lo yischashav, and among the nations it is not counted. That's, of course, our pasuk that we read a moment ago. Yesh ledaktek, we need to analyze. Mahu merosh tsurim. What does it mean when it says from the top of rocks? What exactly is Bilam alluding to when he talks about from the top of rocks? By the way, it's understood that the Zera Shimshon is not just asking about from the top of rocks. He's also asking about the fact that the pasuk says from the top of rocks and also from the top of hills, which seems like a double language, like redundant. And you can see as we go a little bit further how we know that that's part of his question. Umahu erenu va'ashurenu. And what does Bilam mean when he says, I have seen it and I have gazed upon it? He uses two different languages, two different words to refer to seeing the Jewish people. Umahu levadad yishkon uvagoyim lo yischashav. And what does it mean when he uses two different languages about the peoples being separate? He says it's a nation that dwells by itself. And then it says, and among the nations, it is not counted. Shenira kefel. From all of these double languages, it appears to be repetitive. The pasuk appears to be saying things twice for no apparent reason. That's our question. Why is Bilam saying double expressions to seemingly say the same things? I looked at them from the top of the rocks and I gazed upon them from the hills. They are a people who dwell alone and they don't count themselves among the nations. Everything seems to be repeated, and Zera Shimshon is asking why. What is the deeper meaning of Bilam's seemingly repetitive phrasing? Next paragraph. V'chosav hakli yakar. The Kli Yakar, the commentator Kli Yakar writes, Al pasuk, on the pasuk in Sefer Yehoshua, Vayomal es b'nei Yisrael, Yehoshua circumcised the Jewish people, Vishuv mol es b'nei Yisrael, and Hashem said, go back and circumcise the Jewish people again. Vizel Lishono Bekitzer. Zera Shimshon says, I'm going to give you a quote from the Kli Yakar commentary, but in a shortened form. Sod Hamila, the secret or the mystery of circumcision, Lihios Peruah Legamre, is for the circumcised area to be completely uncovered. We'll explain what this means in a moment. Shehu remez legiloi oro yisborach el amo ve'el chasidov, completely uncovering the site, the location of where a circumcision is done. Of course, that usually means on the baby's penis, but it could mean adults, as we know from the psukim in Yehoshua, and as we know from modern experience if a person converts. This hints to the uncovering of Hashem's light, to the revealing, I should say, of Hashem's light to his people and to his righteous ones. V'lo yitachen bimei ha'avos. This was not possible at the time of the patriarchs. Ki adayin koach haklipa, because the power of the source of impurity, shel hapriya, of the membrane that needs to be uncovered during a bris milah, mechase or hamila, covered the light of the circumcision. Let's pause for a moment. What the Zera Shimshon, in quoting the Kli Yakar, is referring to here is something that's, of course, known to all, to mohalim, to who do circumcision, and to many other people who either study the laws of Milah or have their own child receive a bris milah, and the mohel explains what he's doing, that there are two steps to the bris milah, to the circumcision. There's the cutting away of the actual foreskin, that extra skin, and then after that skin is cut away, there's a membrane that continues, that is still there, is still present on the spot where the skin has been pulled back and cut away. That membrane is also removed, and that membrane is the second step of the bris milah, and both of those are done. What the Kli Yakar is referring to here is that in the time of the Avos, they did not, when they did bris milah, of course, we all know in Sefer Bereshis, Hashem gave Avraham the mitzvah of milah, and he was very quick to circumcise himself, even though he was in his old age, to circumcise his son Yishmael, to circumcise many of the members of his household who were slaves that he had purchased. That was the mitzvah of bris milah, which of course he passed on to Yitzchak, and Yitzchak passed on to Yaakov, and it went on and was passed on to the Jewish people. But what Kli Yakar is saying is that in the time of the Avos, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, they only did one of the two steps. They only removed the foreskin. They did not remove the membrane, which that removal of the membrane is called priya. So there's milah and priya. Milah, the removing of the foreskin; priya, the removing of the membrane as the second step. So Avram Avinu in his time and the Avos in their time were not able to do both steps because the power of the forces of impurity were so strong at that time that Hashem viewed it as inappropriate or untimely, you might say, for them to even try and remove the membrane as well as the foreskin. Let's continue. Shekain, we're on the top of the column on the left. Shekain nischayev be'avon adam harishon. It became obligatory after the sin of Adam Harishon, lahashlit hara al hatov, for evil to have dominance over good in the world. Ucheshebo Avraham, when Avraham came into the world, hizchil lisakein mashekilkel Adam Harishon kanoda. He began to repair the damage that was done by the sin of Adam Harishon, kanoda, as is known. V'chein Yitzchak, v'chein Yaakov. And so too Yitzchak and Yaakov continued the repair work, the tikkun, the spiritual repair work that was needed to be done in the world after the sin of Adam Harishon. Ve'achar kach nichnesu b'neihem b'chor habarzel b'Mitzrayim. After the time of the Avos, their children, their great-grandchildren, entered the crucible, the iron crucible of Egypt. Ve'od holchu b'midbar nocha saraf ve'akrav, and after they went through the purification process of exile and suffering in Mitzrayim, then they went out into the wilderness, which was a place of snakes and serpents and scorpions, kedei lahachlish kocham u'lesakein hakol, in order to weaken the power of the klipa, the spiritual impurity in the world, and to repair everything. So Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov started the work. Bnei Yisrael in Mitzrayim, in exile and slavery, and then continuing in the Midbar with all of its difficulties and its challenges and its sufferings. All of this continued to weaken the powers of impurity in the world. Va'achar kach gamar hatikon, and afterwards to complete the repair, nichnesu la'eretz hakedosha, they entered the Holy Land. So what we see here in the Kli Yakar is this idea that there were two stages of circumcision. The original observance of circumcision that was done in the time of the Avos and later, which involved only milah, only the first step of removing the foreskin. And then later on, and we'll see what later on means in a moment, at a later point, after that's after Bnei Yisrael entered Eretz Yisrael, then milah was done with both steps. Then a full milah was done with both milah and priya, removing of the foreskin and removing of the membrane, because by that time, the forces of impurity in the world had been so battered down and beaten and weakened, first by the Yovos, then by their descendants, then by Bnei Yisrael and Mitzrayim, and during the Golos, experiences of the Golos and Egypt, and the Yetzias Mitzrayim, and all of those things, and the Midbar, everything served to weaken the klipa, the klipos, the powers of impurity. And by the time Bnei Yisrael, the Jewish people, entered Eretz Yisrael, then they were in a position where they could do a full bris milah with both parts. Next paragraph. Ve'omrinan beperek ches Yevamos, and it says, and we say in the 8th chapter of Maseches Yevamos, nitna prias milah le'Avram Avinu. Sorry, excuse me, I missed the word. Lo nitna prias milah le'Avram Avinu. The Gemara Chazal clearly state in Maseches Yevamos that the element, the component of milah, which is called priya, the removal of the membrane, was not given to Avram Avinu. V'hatam, we've now moved to the next page, column on the right. V'hatam, and the reason was, shelefi sha'adayin lo gamar l'sakin pegam adam harishon, since Avram Avinu had not completed the work of repair of the blemish, of the damage done by the sin of Adam Harishon, lo hoya biyodo legoresh aklipo mikol vachol. It was not in his power to completely chase away, to completely dominate and overpower the klipa, the forces of impurity. V'lochein lo nisgala or yud shel hapriya. And therefore, the light of the Yud represents Hashem's name, wasn't revealed through the act of Priya, the act of removal of the membrane as the second step of Bris Milah. Aval kishenichnesu la'aretz, but when they entered Eretz Yisrael, uchvar nigmar hatikun, and the work of repair was finally completed, v'lo hoya od nochash sora ve'akrav, and they no longer had to contend as they did in the Midbar with snakes and serpents and scorpions, which are all symbols of the kochos hatuma, the powers of impurity. Then it became a time when everything that was desired could be done. In other words, the things could be done in the best way and not in the second best way. And so Hashem said, I'm giving you telling you to do now, you can do the mitzvah of circumcision, including not just milah, but also priya. Shehakadusha sharsa ba'aretz, because holiness dwelled and was ensconced in the land. V'lo hoya od pachad me'aklipa, there was no reason to be fearful or afraid of the powers of impurity. Ki goresh gershu osa, because it had been completely chased away and rejected. V'ayin sham, and see there in the kliyokar. So now we can understand what the kliyokar is telling us, is teaching us that when Hashem told Yehoshua, go back and circumcise the people for a second time, it did not just refer to the straightforward explanation given in Sefer Yehoshua about this was going to be a second mass circumcision ceremony. There was one before the Jewish people left Egypt, and those people, many of those people died out in the Midbar, but the people who were born in the Midbar weren't circumcised, and now we're going to do a mass circumcision again. All true, all accurate, right in the Psukim and Sefer Yehoshua. But in addition to that, Kliyokar is saying people who received the Bris Milah before Bnei Yisrael entered Eretz Yisrael only received one step. They only received Milah. They didn't receive Priya. And now Hashem was saying to Yoshua, you can do both steps. And every person who you're circumcised can receive both Milah and Priya. The foreskin will be removed and the membrane will be removed. And only at that point, I should say, when all of the things that had led up from Avram Avinu, from the Avos, had led up to the Bnei Yisrael entering Eretz Yisrael under the leadership of Yoshua, only at that moment, when they crossed into the land and they were embraced by the holiness of the land, they embraced the holiness of the land, then they could do Milah that had both steps. Next paragraph. V'yuvan hatam sheYehoshua asa osan giva. It can be the reason why Yehoshua made a hill, a pile of the removed foreskins can be understood. Kedichsiv el givas ha'arolos, as the pasuk said. This is one of the psukim we read in the beginning. It said the name of the place was the hill of the foreskins, the hill of the arolos, and Chazal teach us that's because it was called that name very literally because as Yoshua circumcised the thousands and thousands of people, he put all the foreskins into a pile. Ulefi madekaim alon, according to what we hold based on a Gemara in Sanhedrin, kinus l'rishayim ra la'olam, bringing together or allowing wicked people or wicked things to come together, ra la'olam. That's bad for the world. Lo haya lo lasos kain. According to that principle, Yoshua should not have done what he did, meaning the foreskins are viewed as something that has a impure power to it, and therefore Yoshua shouldn't have piled them up. He should have kept them all separate and discarded them separately. But since it was already weakened, and the power of the impure forces was removed, Yoshua had no more concern. And because of this, to demonstrate the fact that now that Bnei Yisrael was in Eretz Yisrael and had done all of the things and experienced all of the things they experienced from the time of the Avos, no longer did the klipas have no longer did the power of impurity have the strength it once had. Asa osam giva, he said, I'm going to put all these foreskins in a pile called the Givas Ha'arolos, in order to show there's no problem, no more concern. The klipa has been beaten down. Next paragraph. V'ha'kosuv, in the pasuk ki merosh tzurim medaber al hamilah. The pasuk in our parsha, when Bilam refers to the head of the rocks, he looked at the Jewish people from the top of the rocks, is a reference, it's an allusion to Bris Milah. Kamosha Pirshu b'Medrash, as it's explained in the Medrash, al pasuk hasamach lo, on the next pasuk, mi mona afar Yaakov. On those words, the Medrash talks about the fact that Bilam was referring to the observance of Bris Milah, of circumcision by the Jewish people. V'chein matzinu b'Yalkut, and so too we find in the Yalkut Shimoni, top of the next column. Al pasuk ki merosh tzurim, on our pasuk when Bilam says from the top, because from the top of rocks I see Bnei Yisrael, I see the nation. Ani tzofe, I am looking ma asidin lasos batsurim, what they will do in the future, what they are destined to do with tzurim, with sharp rocks or sharp knives. Aseh lecha harvos tzurim, as the pasuk in Yoshua clearly used this word tzurim. Hashem said, make for yourself sharp knives. And so Bilam, when he used the word merosh tzurim, he was referring to this future episode of Yoshua doing circumcision on the Jewish people with harvos tzurim. Ki rosh tzurim enu, because from the top of the rocks I see him, I see it, the nation. Klomar, ani ro'eh shahamila nitno lerosh tzurim. I see that circumcision was given to the person who can be referred to as the rosh tzurim, the head of the tzurim, shehu Avraham. This is a reference to Avraham. Ve'acher kach priya nitna bizman she'osu ha'arolos giva. And later on, not just Mila, but the additional step of Priya was given in the time when the foreskins were turned into a hill, Bimei Yehoshua. That was in the time of Yehoshua. She'oz nigmar hatukun, because then the repair, the spiritual repair was completed, v'lo hayu lahem od pachad, and there was no more fear. So when Bilam says, Ki me rosh tzurim erenu, I see the top of the rocks, he's referring to how Mila was done in the time of Avram Avinu. And then when he talks about I'm gazing upon them from the hills, he was referring to the future hill that Yoshua made at the time of the mass bris milah, and then Bilam was alluding to the fact, I see in the future the Jewish people are going to be on such a high spiritual level that they're no longer worried. They have no more fear about the kochos atuma, the powers of impurity, and that's why Yoshua was able to fully observe the mitzvah of milah with both its parts, and even make a pile of the arelos. V'zehu ashurenu. And this is why Bilam changed his word from seeing the people, arenu, to ashurenu. I'm gazing. Loshan habota ve'iyun baseichel. Ashurenu is a language that denotes looking closely at and analyzing something with intelligence. So Bilam meant, I can see what happened before with Avram Avinu. I'm aware of the fact that he practiced Milah and the Avos practiced Milah, and I'm gazing into the future, and I understand, Ashurenu, I understand the significance of the fact that the Jewish people will reach a level when they will be able to fully observe Milah in both its stages in the time of the Giva, the hill that Yoshua made. Kemoshe Pirish Haradak, the Shoresh Shur, as the Radak, the great grammarian explains on the root Shin Vav Resh, which is of course the root for Ashurenu, to gaze upon something. Next paragraph. Umishum hachi ani omer, and because of this is now as if quoting Bilam. Because I understand this, Bilam says, ani omer, I say, Hen om levadod yishkon. Because I get all of this and the spiritual significance of this, I now say the Jewish people are a nation that dwells alone. Shebishvil ha'mila nikroim Yisrael badad. Because of the mitzvah of bris milah, the Jewish people are called badad, alone. They're separate. They're not like anyone else because they observe and practice the mitzvah of milah. Kidei amrinan b'chelek, as we say in the chapter of chelek in Maseches Sanhedrin, anon dimehalinan, we who practice circumcision, lo matzinon lemeheve kivasaichu, we are not considered to be like you. We have bris milah, and therefore we are fundamentally different than the idolatrous nations of the world. Ve'od, and more so, atah shenidna lahem hapriya. Bilam says, you're separate just because starting with the Avos, when you started practicing bris milah, that made you separate and unique. Now, in the time of Yoshua, and I'm foretelling the fact that at that time the Jews will be able to do the step of Priya also, v'nechlisha hatuma mikol v'chol, and that will signify that impurity has been completely weakened in the world. Af im lo yomulu es atzmam, even if they do not circumcise themselves. Let's imagine the Jewish people before Yehoshua was able to do the mass circumcision ceremony after they crossed into Eretz Yisrael. Before that time, or a person, imagine a baby who was not well and hadn't yet had a circumcision. Lo yiyu nikroim arelim kamo hagoyim. We do not call such a person, a Jewish person who hasn't had a circumcision, we don't call such a person arelim, which means an uncircumcised individual, kamo hagoyim, as we would if the person was not Jewish. Non-Jewish people in the world are called arelim, uncircumcised. But a Jewish person, after the time of the Jewish people entering Eretz Yisrael under Yoshua, even if the person had not yet had a circumcision, would not be referred to as an orel. Rak mulim, such a person would be referred to as a circumcised person, kamo Yisrael, like a regular Jewish person. Again, even though technically the person hadn't yet had the circumcision. Kedisnan bin Nidorim, as the Mishnah teaches in Maseches Nidorim, konam she'eni nehene lamulim. If a person takes a vow and says that he will not benefit from mulim, from circumcised people, osur be'arle Yisrael, that person is not allowed, because of his or her vow, to get any benefit from even uncircumcised Jewish people. Umuter b'mule umos, but the person would be permitted to get benefit, to derive benefit from even a circumcised non-Jewish person. V'zehu v'agoyim lo yischashav, and this is the deeper meaning of what Bilam meant when he said, and among the nations, the Jewish people are not counted. So let's pause to make sure we understand this very, very subtle but important point. The Zera Shimshon is saying, to go back and answer the last part of his original question, the first paragraph, why did Bilam repeat two phrases that seem to say the same thing in different words? Number one, the Jewish people dwells alone, and two, the Jewish people are not counted among the nations of the world. Why did he say both of those phrases? So the Zera Shimshon is, in this last paragraph, is saying the first statement was a statement about Milah from the time of the Avos. And the time of the Avos, the Jewish people were given a mitzvah and started practicing circumcision. And right from that moment, they were considered badad, separated from the nations of the world, who Hashem did not give the mitzvah of circumcision to. Later, when Bilam gazed into the future and saw that a time would come when the Jewish people would so thoroughly dominate and remove the kohen and weaken the kochos hatuma, the impure powers of the world, that they would be given, Hashem would give them the ability to do both parts of the bris milah ceremony. At that point, the Jewish people reached a spiritual level when even if a person had not yet been circumcised, he would still be considered a person who had been circumcised. And that's considered in the category of mulim, as opposed to the category of arelim. And that we see clearly demonstrated with this really kind of amazing Mishnah from the Dorim at the end there, where a person who makes this unusual vow and says he's taking a vow not to get any benefit from people who are circumcised, it turns out that he's now can't get benefit from any Jewish person, even if the Jewish person hasn't yet been circumcised. And as we mentioned, let's imagine a man who, for health reasons, hasn't been circumcised yet. Even so, that man is considered in the category of mulim, because he's part of the Jewish people, and their spiritual power and spiritual strength from the time of entering Eretz Yisrael under Yehoshua's leadership is such that he is considered in the category of circumcised, whereas a non-Jewish person would be considered an orel, even if he was circumcised for some reason. Obviously, that doesn't include a non-Jew who goes through circumcision and all the steps of a conversion ceremony, in which case that person would, of course, no longer be considered uncircumcised. He would be considered a full-fledged Jewish person, and since he had bris milah as part of the gerus, he would be considered fully circumcised. So the Zera Shimshon has really taken us on a very fascinating journey, starting with a kind of cryptic statement that Bilam makes in our parsha about gazing and looking at the Jews from rocks and hills. Hard to know exactly what Bilam's saying. Zera Shimshon says, let me use the Kli Yakar. Let me introduce you to the Kli Yakar's explanation. Let me show you a couple of psukim in Sefer Yehoshua. Let's put it all together. And then, he circled back to help us understand exactly what Bilam was saying on a deep level and give us an appreciation for kind of a historical look at the mitzvah of Milah, how it started with the Avos and how it changed over time starting with Yehoshua and the people as after they came into Eretz Yisrael. And of course, doing a bris milah with both steps, the milah and the priya, is how it continued until our own time and the way that the mitzvah of milah is done today. Yasher Koch for joining in the learning on this week's parsha. We look forward, with Hashem's help, to learning together in the Zera Shimshon on next week's parsha.